Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing today other than coming here and listening to what's going to be a wonderful history lesson. So thank you all for coming out. My name is Bob Moore. I'm the editor of the El Paso Times. And you might ask what I'm doing up here, because I certainly am asking that too, especially looking at this distinguished panel who really knows what they're talking about. But the reason I'm here is Adair. Perfect timing as always, Adair. Thank you. Adair and I met more than a year ago as we were actually discussing Tom Lee Month for 2012 and what was going to go on. And I told Adair when we were meeting, one of the things that struck me as odd is that Lyndon Johnson had such a profound effect on El Paso, but in all of my years living here, I don't recall anybody doing a presentation on Lyndon Johnson's impact on El Paso. And she says, "That's a wonderful idea. Thanks for volunteering to be in charge of it." Adair and the folks at the Tom Lee Institute certainly have done really all the heavy lifting in lining up some really wonderful presentations. Those of you who were with us last night got to hear, I think, just a really touching and informative presentation from Michael Gillette from Humanities Texas about Lady Bird Johnson, and then a brief taste of what Gus Sanchez has to offer, our new superintendent of the Chamizal, and I'll introduce Gus in a second. So we got off to a wonderful start last night, and today should be even more invigorating. We have several panels that will really explore some different facets of President Johnson's life and his impact in El Paso in particular, and surprisingly, his deep roots in El Paso. I think most of you who are familiar with history know the story of how President Johnson was elected to the Senate in 1948. He was running against a very popular former governor of Texas named Coke Stevenson, and it was a very pitched race, and I think Robert Caro probably has the best description of that race if you want to go back and read it. But President Johnson, or then Congressman Johnson, wound up winning that race by 87 votes out of more than 1 million cast, forever earning the nickname, I heard it right over from Sam, Landslide Lyndon. And some of you may know that Mr. Johnson may have owed his victory to some shenanigans in Duval County, down in the Rio Grande Valley, where some ballots kind of magically turned up late, and so there's always this legend that George Parr, man known as the Duke of Duval County, is the one who really launched Lyndon Johnson on the road to the White House. I take some issue with that. I think we in El Paso can claim some credit for that. In that 1948 election, Lyndon Johnson came to El Paso and campaigned in the runoff against Governor Stevenson. Governor Stevenson never came to El Paso then, as now. We were sort of at the nether regions of Texas, and it was hard to get political attention, but Lyndon Johnson made sure to come out and give El Paso the attention it deserved, and as a result, he won El Paso County by about 3,300 votes. He beat Governor Stevenson by about 2-1. So the way I look at it, if it had not been for Lyndon Johnson's overwhelming popularity in El Paso, he never would have been in position to steal the election in Duval County. So we can claim some credit for that. So the first panel we have today, we'll talk about probably the most visible legacy of Lyndon Johnson in El Paso, and that's the settlement that eventually ended a long dispute with Mexico over boundary issues in the Chamizal area. And Lyndon Johnson's interest in this preceded by a number of years his ascendancy to the vice presidency and then eventually the presidency, and we'll hear some discussion about that. But the Chamizal Treaty, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and a bit of good timing for us, really settled what was a thorn in the side of U.S.-Mexico relationships going back for a century. And Lyndon and certainly President Kennedy deserves a lot of credit for that settlement and his counterparts in Mexico. But Lyndon Johnson also played an important role, and we'll hear some of that from our panelists today. But we have just a wonderful panel many of whom were witnesses to key moments in the Chamizal Treaty negotiations, and then eventually the settlement, and then the implementation of the settlement that really sort of reshaped, literally reshaped the boundary area and what is now the Chamizal National Memorial and the Bowie High School area. And I'll start from your left, my right here, with just brief introductions. First, we have Travis Johnson, who is one of the definitive political figures in 20th century El Paso history, especially late 20th century history. He was county judge, has been deeply involved in virtually every facet of the emergence of El Paso over the last 50 years. Next to him is Nestor Valencia, who was an urban planner for the city of El Paso for a number of years, and then after retiring from the city of El Paso, came to work for the El Paso Community Foundation and continued to do some marvelous development work for our community. Most notably, I think, the room and the facility we're sitting in today. And Nestor was very instrumental in revitalizing the Plaza Theater and the area around it. Next to Nestor is Gus Sanchez. Gus is the new superintendent of the Chamizal National Memorial. He's been here since May, is that right, Gus?
Yes.
And I think most of you know the original plan was to have this discussion where it should be, which is at the Chamizal National Memorial. We had some great plans. We met with Gus and his staff for months to really pull this together. And then Congress happened, and we had to scramble. Gus is one of the 800,000 or so furloughed government employees. Gus is actually here today as a private citizen, not as the superintendent of the Chamizal, because it would actually be a crime for him to work. So we appreciate private citizen Sanchez coming out today. Next to Gus is Cruzito. Cruz had a very long and distinguished career with the International Boundary and Water Commission, which was really the key agency that was involved in really the heavy lifting of the Chamizal, how to handle all of the technical issues with the river and with the land, and he worked with perhaps the most important people in the whole Chamizal development, and I'll let him explain that. Next to him is Sam Moore, a longtime El Paso attorney and legendary trout fisherman. I think it's the latter that he's most proud of. Sam was, again, deeply involved in a lot of political developments in El Paso over the last 40 to 50 years, and personally had the opportunity to witness some key moments in the development of the Chamizal Treaty, and saw, as he'll explain to you, some really masterful diplomacy at work. And then finally, at the end of the table, we have Nick Hauser, who is a historian and author, and is deeply involved, obviously, in the 12 Travelers Project and a lot of the research that's gone into the 12 Travelers development. He's currently focusing a lot of energy on the study of Benito Juarez, who, of course, played a very significant role in the development of our area here. And we look forward to hearing Nick's comments. So now I'll turn it over to the panel, and I'm going to try to stay out of the way as much as possible. And I'd like to start with Travis, if I might.
Probably loud enough where you can hear me without the microphone. Sally, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I think that's fine. Thank you. Over the years, I have been asked to talk about the settlement. And after I get through the talk, I always ask the people in the audience if they have any questions. And one question always comes up. Well, what did El Paso get out of it? That's what we want to know. What were the benefits for El Paso? And I want to tell you the benefits, thanks to LBJ and a lot of people, a lot of the leaders here, we got a lot out of it. We did very well. LBJ was very enthusiastic about having the local leadership here involved and supportive of the settlement of this dispute. He was dedicated to trying to get all of us on board. And the politics then was just like it is now, very, very muddled, I don't have to explain that to you. But in addition to seeing to it that the people that were displaced, the landowners, got adequate compensation for their land, we came up with three things, I call them perks, that we wanted. And LBJ agreed to wholeheartedly support us in trying to get these three things that we wanted. One of them was the border highway. The other one is called the Chamizal National Memorial. I call it the Chamizal Park. So if I say park, it's the Chamizal National Memorial. And the third one was the extension, 13-mile extension of the American Canal. And those are the three things that we wanted. And the president wholeheartedly agreed to make that part of his package and endorse us and help us. The problem is that all three of these things call for legislation. LBJ couldn't just write us a check and say, here you go, here's your deal, go ahead. We had to go to Congress and we had to put up a fight for the legislation, but it was considered to be White House sponsored legislation. Senator Yarborough agreed to handle the legislation, the three legislative bills on the Senate side, and Congressman Richard White agreed to handle the legislation on the House side. Commissioner Joe Friedkin, he was the IBWC commissioner who was designated, and Cruz will talk more about that later, to handle all of the activities. Commissioner Friedkin and Mayor Judson Williams put together a team to go to Washington on a number of occasions and lobby and testify before the different congressional committees on these three pieces of legislation. The team that they put together was Judson Williams, representing the city of El Paso, and I was the county judge at that time, and I was representing the county of El Paso. Dr. Charles was the superintendent of the El Paso Independent School District. He was on the team. And then representing the El Paso Chamber of Commerce were two of our prominent business people who they both served as president of the El Paso Chamber. Ray Lockhart, who some of you knew, who was the president of the electric company, and Fred Hervey. And everybody was on the same page. I was kind of like a moderate Democrat, and those of you that knew Hervey, he was a very conservative Republican. But we were always committed to work on this, and we did work on it. And we had one ex officio member that went with us and helped us write our speeches and carry the suitcases and things like that. And it was your colleague, Jonathan Cunningham, who you know real well. That was a team. We made these trips. I was always, because I was considered to be a liberal Democrat, I was the one that had to go give the briefings to Ralph Yarborough and to Jim Wright. Judson was kind of a moderate Republican, so he went and gave the briefings to Richard White. And then we had Hervey go talk to John Tower, and we broke it up that way. the legislation, the border highway went through pretty easily. We didn't have a lot of problems with that. And then we got to the park. The park, and I'm gonna call it the park now. I've already told you what the official name is. The park was underneath the jurisdiction, under the jurisdiction, like it is now, of the National Park Service. Well, we ran into some problems on that because every congressman wants a National Park Service in their area. You know, they all would like to have some sort of a national park facility in their district. So in that, we had a little bit more trouble with that one. All of us, the whole team had to testify before the Senate and before the Congress. And it was a little bit more lobbying effort, and we had to exert ourselves. But it passed too. So we got the two bills passed, and I feel fortunate in that LBJ gave me pins from the signing of both pieces of legislation. Now we get into the extension of the American Canal. The canal, the legislation was pending. The canal, like the park, was under the National Park System. The canal was slated to be under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Reclamation. It was going to be a Bureau of Reclamation project. The officials at the Bureau of Reclamation were they were so positive because LBJ was, they knew this was his deal, and the whole El Paso community was all in support. The leadership had testified on the other legislation, and the Bureau of Reclamation was so positive that the legislation would pass that they spent over $1 million in plans before the legislation moved forward. And in the plans, it's what they found out. It's a 13-mile canal, concrete lined. They found out that if we did this canal, running from up where Hacienda Restaurant was, down past the Zaragoza Bridge, that we knew this ourselves through things that the PSB had done and others. We knew that we would be able, because of the inefficiency of transporting that water through the river, we knew that we would salvage bring back to El Paso about 25,000 acre-feet of new water. That's what that canal means to us, 25,000 acre-feet. Plus, I don't want to step on any toes here, and I'm going to, but I hope not. But also, some of the farmers over in Mexico would put their pumps in the river and steal the water. I can't use any other word. They get their water through a treaty. We won't get into the treaty, but there was some theft. And I'll talk more about the project later. Anyway, they spent it, they had these studies, they were prepared to go. The problem that we ran into, Senator Fulbright was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. The Vietnam War was really controversial then. I mean, it was at its peak of controversy. And Fulbright was mad at LBJ. And Fulbright was extremely bitter towards LBJ. He killed the legislation. We didn't get it through. Even though they'd spent over $1 million in studies and showed what a benefit it would be, we never got hearings, nothing. Fulbright saw to it that it died. But we got the other two passed. of the park and the highway. Now, the good news is that over 20 years later, the canal extension came back. And one of the people that helped it come back is sitting over here. He's taking a nap, I think. Bob Yavara, wake up, man. He was official at the International Boundary Commission, the IBWC at that time. What happened? The Riverside Diversion Dam. That was the dam on the other side of the Zaragoza Bridge, and that was the dam that was used to divert the water into the agriculture community. And that in 1987, that dam broke, and the people that are in charge of that, it's the El Paso County Water Improvement District number 1. Guy's a member of the El Paso County Water Improvement District number 1. I'm going to call it the irrigation district. So you'll know if I say irrigation district, you know what I'm talking about. When the dam broke and they were going to have to replace it, the original legislation that had the reclamation as in charge, and it was under their jurisdiction, called for a local match. In fact, the old legislation that says that any Bureau of Reclamation project requires a 50-50 match. So that meant that the canal, if we'd have gotten it through originally, we'd have to put up 50, and the government puts up 50 of the cost of the canal. So Johnny Stubbs, who is president of that district and is still president of the irrigation district, came to me as a lawyer. I was practicing law then, and part of my practice was handling legislative items in Austin and Washington. And you're going to say, well, he was a lobbyist. I hate that word. You know, I was representing some corporations in Washington and in Austin. And Stubbs came to me and he said, why don't we try to get that canal back on track? We're going to have to spend maybe $2 or $3 million to replace the dam. So rather than spending that money to replace the dam, why don't we get the canal and then we can just put up our money for the canal, since it's going to have a match. Well, that sounded pretty good, but we had some problems. One, it was under the jurisdiction and then of the Bureau of Reclamation, and who are we going to get to take it on? For years, Bob, I'm sorry, I know you go by Bob now, Bob Yavara and I had talked about trying to figure out some way to get this thing going again. And we met. Commissioner Friedkin had retired. Commissioner Ganaji had not come on board yet. And so anyway, Bob and I came up with the idea that if we could get the IBWC to take it on, then we could go for whole funding from the federal government. So that was the plan. Bob was to go back and talk to his colleagues, which he did, Cruz, and then Ganaji came on board and Bob gave him briefings and Commissioner Ganaji came on board. My job was to go back to the Bureau of Reclamation and see if they'd give up the project, number one, and then see if they'd give us those plans. They had over $1 million invested. So the IBWC agreed to take it on, and we went to talk to Gene Hines, who was the district director at that time, and he thought it was a good idea that we let the IBWC let them have jurisdiction, and he gave us those plans. So the next step, this is how I earn my pay. The next step, I went and visited with Senator Benson and Congressman Ron Coleman, and they agreed to handle the legislation. And they did a great job. What we tried to do with the legislation, we tried to get all the funding from the federal government. It had been established then, unofficially by the IBWC, that the project was going to be like about a $48 million project, a 13-mile concrete canal. And that was our goal, to get the full funding from the feds if we could. Well, we didn't make the goal, but we got the legislation passed, and we got 42 million from the feds, which I thought was pretty good. And the local entity, the irrigation district, agreed to put up 5 million. And I thought that was a good trade. We put up 5 and they put up 42. And I want to say this to you two guys that are here. The IBWC did a wonderful job with that project, as they have with every project that I've ever seen them or been involved with them on. I'd like to compliment them. It's an agency we have here that really doesn't get enough credit. Johnson felt so good, LBJ, about the job they did on the Chamizal settlement, that he designated Commissioner Friedkin a well-deserved title of ambassador. And I'm going to close, I talked too long. It was the greatest community effort where everybody put their politics aside and we worked together. And I give Judson Williams a lot of credit for that, because he brought some of these people to the table that were a little reluctant to come. So thanks for listening to me.
I think that's a great transition. You were working for Judson Williams at the time, so talk about from your perspective, the city's perspective, what was going on.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with the distinguished panel, and thank you for coming to discuss a little bit about the Chamizal settlement. The Chamizal Treaty itself represents something that is bigger than, our region. It represents a willingness of two countries to come together and resolve an issue, a land issue, which between countries is very difficult to resolve because of the foreign lands, and to give up parts of your country. But in this instance, there were some basic, fundamental developments that had occurred back 100 years ago in different treaties with Mexico that gave us the legal basis to resolve the Chamizal issue. We had in the Chamizal settlement a win-win situation. And I was very fortunate to be at the right place at the right time as a young, energetic, budding city planner that had the opportunity to work on this project for 8 years of my life. And that was one of my highlights in my career. As we talk, I think the panel is going to agree and disagree on some issues, and we're going to overlap. And one of the many issues is the Franklin Canal, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But in 19 you know, we all know that the Chamizal issue was around for about 100 years before we came to an agreement to erase that issue, that problem between the two countries. In 1962, as we all know, Kennedy and Lopez Mateos met in Mexico City, and they probably had several issues to discuss, but one of them was the settlement of the Chamizal, or not the settlement, but the issue between the two countries. The presidents agreed that they would instruct the respective boundary commissioners to get together and find a solution to the issue once and for all. On the U.S. side, we had, of course, Commissioner Friedkin, Joseph Friedkin, who was an absolute ambassador. He was a gentleman, he was a diplomat, and he was one of the greatest guys that I had ever worked with and met. On the Mexican side, we had Commissioner David Herrera Jordan, Ingeniero David Herrera Jordan, who you had to meet this gentleman, who was also a diplomat, a true gentleman, and a very professional person. And they both got together, and within months, they came back and presented a plan for the resolution of the issue. We all know that the Chamizal, the original Chamizal property, did not go to Mexico. Some of it did, some of it didn't. The problem or the issue on the Chamizal was 437 acres of land that was in dispute. That from the river channel of 1864, 1852, when the river violently changed its course to 1864, those were the 437 acres of land that were left in dispute, because overnight the river channel changed, and some of the property that was Mexico was north of the river. And as we all know, the river was supposed to be the boundary. That is where the whole issue began. Was the boundary the 1852 river channel, or was the boundary the new river channel that was created as a result of the flood? In 1963, as Travis mentioned, the city immediately upon the Chamizal Treaty getting really hot in 1962 and 63, the city of El Paso put together a four-point program ahead of the game, because we knew that the Chamizal program was imminent, that it was going to happen. It certainly, of course, we had both governments to agree to everything that was happening, but as Travis mentioned, there were 4 points. One was adequate compensation for the property owners. That meant that the people that were affected by the Chamizal Treaty, by the new boundary, that lost their property, would get adequate compensation. The other issue was a border highway along the new channel. Now, the original plans did not call for a long border highway. It was really from Stand Street to Cordova Island. That was the original idea of the border highway. Thank God that we took it all the way to Isleta, took it all the way around the mountain, Trans Mountain, back to downtown. That happened subsequently. The third was to establish a Chamizal National Memorial, and that happened with a lot of work, a lot of the proper politics and so forth, and then the relocation of the American Canal, which was one of the issues that were in the 4-point program that the city presented. all of them happened. All of the, President Lyndon Johnson not only embraced the plan, he welcomed the idea of putting all these things in place as part of the Chamizal program, the whole package. The relocation of the Franklin Canal that used to traverse in South El Paso used to take lives of children that used to swim there for years and years and years. We got that done during the Chamizal Treaty. We took the Franklin Canal from South El Paso and put it next to the river for a short distance, let's say from the Hacienda Cafe to basically Copia Street. We got that done. That was done by 1969, 1970. So there was a lot of things that occurred that were very beneficial to the city. We were able to improve enormously the border between the two cities, the border area, by the removal of certain obnoxious heavy industries such as the patent packing company, stockyards, rendering plants, and all that. And so there were probably 15, 20 major benefits that the city got out of the treaty itself. On the U.S. side, on the Mexican side, the Mexico also got an enormous push in the beautification and revitalization of that area. So as we talk, and I hope we can come back and talk about other, specific issues. But basically, there were a lot of benefits to the city, and I'll just point out a few to you. One is, of course, we got a new boy high school and vocational school. That was extremely important to us because the Chamizal really shared the old boy and took practically half of the boy campus and so forth. We got above grade bridges across the international line. We were able to separate rail, vehicular, and pedestrian traffic in this area that we're talking about. They used to be at grade. Juarez built a long, beautiful park in what ended up being the old river channel. It's still there, it's being used, it's a beautiful development. And of course, we've got the two national memorials, one on each side. And we've got the irrigation canal relocated, and Juarez got a large sports arena in the Chamizal settlement. And the border highway, as I mentioned before, was a major victory for El Paso and the community. And what can we say? We were able to get a pretty negative land use pattern in this area and transform it into what it is now. So I'll leave it there and we'll come back.
Thanks. Thank you, Nestor. When I introduced Gus earlier, I left off one very important part of his biography. Before coming to El Paso, Gus was the chief ranger at the Lyndon B Johnson National Historic Site in the Hill. Is that a national park? National Historical Park. He really brings a lot of deep knowledge about President Johnson in a broader context. And one of the impressive things that he's put together is a photo exhibit at the Chamizal that sort of traces President Johnson, or then Senator Johnson's involvement with Mexican leadership in a way that was really unprecedented for a Senate Majority Leader. Had our government functioned the way it says it should function in civic textbooks, I would be inviting you now to go out in the lobby of the Chamizal to enjoy the photo exhibit. That's not possible right now, but I would encourage you when the Chamizal reopens, which we hope will probably be next week if things go as they now appear, to stop by the Chamizal and look at the presentation that Gus has put together. And with that, Gus, one of the things I think a lot of people may not understand is that Lyndon Johnson had an interest in the Chamizal before other U.S. leaders. So can you talk a little bit about Lyndon Johnson's history with both the Chamizal and the emerging leadership in Mexico?
Yes, thank you for that generous introduction. I wanted to mention how honored I feel to be surrounded by this distinguished panel that lived through this part of history. But one of the things that I really wanted to bring to the forefront, as Mr. Moore pointed out, is the fact that there's a lot of mythology about LBJ, with good reason. Some of it he created himself. He was a masterful politician, and that's one of the things that I think that is overlooked by his many critics at times. Now, believe me, I served over 10 years at Lyndon B Johnson National Historical Park, and I probably know more about LBJ than I ever wanted to. But the subject is just fascinating. And as I was sharing with the group last night before Dr. Gillette spoke, you know, there's more books that have been published about President Lyndon Johnson than any other U.S. president in history. Now, a lot of people like him. Some people absolutely hate him, and there's everything else in between. But no matter what your point of view is, he is a fascinating and significant character in U.S. history. But it actually extends long before he was the President of the United States. And in this story of Chamizal, that's one of the most important things that people can learn about how this works. Now, I want to use an example that I learned in my research while working at LBJ National Historical Park. You know, after LBJ had pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, some reporters approached him and asked him why, he says, early in your career, you didn't seem to support civil rights. And later, as time changed, you came out in full support of civil rights, and they asked him why the change. And Lyndon Johnson's short answer to that, he was the president then, was free at last, free at last. And then, although he sort of refused to answer the question, but in my research and talking to the people closest to him, especially Lady Bird Johnson, who I got to know later in her life, he had expressed to several of his close friends and colleagues that he understood how government worked. He was the ultimate insider. So he says, when I was a congressman, I represented my district. And when I was a senator, I had to represent the state. But when I was president, I had to make decisions that benefited the entire country. Some would say that that might be a kind of a cop-out. But I'd say that and some historians have blamed LBJ for that. They say that's proof of how political he was. But the other side of that argument becomes that he's still able to accomplish things in the system. Now, you know, one of the arguments that we've heard in more recent history, and I guess when the next presidential election comes up, we'll hear it again. You hear both parties bring it up. And you've heard it, so I'll kind of paraphrase it. We don't want another Washington insider. We want an outsider that's going to bring fresh ideas to Washington and change things. Have y'all heard this before?
Yes.
Okay, every time there's a presidential primary, this comes out. Well, don't have time, and I'm not going to argue the validity of that argument. But the fact is that I think that Lyndon B Johnson was the ultimate insider. He had served as a secretary to a congressman, got elected to the House of Representatives, got elected to the Senate, became a U.S. Senator. In less than 4 years, he became the Senate Majority Leader. Many historians will argue the most powerful one in history. He served as the Vice President, and then eventually as President of the United States. When he became the President, his style and his approach to legislation and doing things like the Chamizal Treaty were that he knew everyone in Washington, D.C. And if he didn't know you, he was going to get to know you. Okay? So it didn't matter if you were a freshman congressman, he might call you at home. If you didn't answer, he was going to talk to your wife. If she wasn't there, he was going to talk to your kids. He didn't stop. Okay? He was a driven man. And one of the things you'll learn is that throughout his career in Washington, almost 30 years, in all of those positions, his entire life is about politics. This is a man who is so obsessed that he gets up at between 3:30 and 4 a.m. every morning and reads the entire congressional record before he went to work. He suffered from insomnia, type A personality, a workaholic in the highest degree. And as I heard Dr. Gillette speak last night about Lady Bird, the incredible effect she had on him, she definitely is part of that. Not only serving as First Lady, but in her ability to calm him down. In our oral history project at LBJ National Park, I remember speaking to people who had worked on his staff. They said, we dreaded when she was going to be gone from DC. We just dreaded it. He was just a monster. He says, we were worried about it. We wanted to be sick, but then we didn't want to face the consequences of that. She calmed him down. She had that ability to help him. So they had this really unusual relationship. But Dr. Gillette also shed more light on that relationship. He was pointing out last night, for example, some of the things that I had learned through my research as well. That not only did Lady Bird have that influence on him, but that she also helped him a lot. Basically, she was the main person. He helped her develop herself, but it was her monetary inheritance that really established the economic fortunes of the Johnson family. She was the one that ran the LBJ radio stations, the LBJ companies, because LBJ didn't have time for anything else except politics. Okay, and that gives her a lot of credit for her to have come from the point where, for a woman to run a major corporation at that time and to do it so successfully. If you talk to the people who work at the radio station and the TV station, they'll tell you, yeah, LBJ was LBJ, but Mrs. Johnson was our boss. It's that clear. And so that sort of drive, I think, gives you a further insight into what kind of a president he was. What's the result of that? In my theory of the ultimate insider, we end up with a president who in less than 5 years pushes through over 1,000 new federal laws. Wonder how long it would take to do that now. Okay, it's important. It's never happened before in history. It'll probably never happen again. It was a significant time in history. The other thing you should know about Lyndon Johnson, throughout all his career, is that he was driven to do what he intended to do. Now, you probably, those of you that have studied him have learned about the Johnson treatment. And some of that I've already described, where he'll just call you. Okay? The president calling a freshman congressman, I mean, at home, that's kind of an unusual thing. How did Robert Dallek, the presidential historian, put it? The telephone was his Excalibur, he said. He loved to talk on the phone. I can imagine if he was alive now, how there would have been 300 channels on a screen, all sorts of staffers keeping up with the latest information. He was famous for the 3 TVs in the living room, so he could keep up with the 3 major news sources. The other thing you should know about LBJ that affects the Chamizal story is that he had learned politics from the ground up. He was the old-time politician. You should remember that. You know, a FDR New Deal Democrat, like Harry Truman, for example. And in fact, he and Truman have these incredible ties when he's sitting as president. It's President Truman who he brings to sit next to him when he signs Medicare into law, since Truman had failed to do that a number of years before. And then I just want to mention a couple of other things. So if you know that about LBJ, that he's driven, that he's going to get these things done, that he will convince you, call you, threaten you if he has to. And he was well known for using his physical size in an intimidating type of way at times. In fact, to pass the Civil Rights Act, he had to actually have a discussion with his old friend, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, who had been his mentor. And he begged Richard Russell, he says, this is important for the country, we have to pass this law. And Russell told him, no, I'm a Southern segregationist Democrat, I can't do that. And apparently Russell, who was very short in stature, LBJ is 6'4", backed him into a corner, got him to where his nose was almost touching his. And he said to him, according to witnesses then, all right, if you can't support me, I accept that. But if you work against me at all, just understand, you made me Senate Majority Leader, and for that I'll be eternally grateful. But if you try to stop this law, I will destroy you. To his mentor, to his lifelong friend. So, a driven man, okay, with all his positive and negative attributes, who was the President of the United States. Well, the other thing he had learned in his long career in traditional politics was, you know, you've heard the saying many times, all politics is local, right? Even though he was the president, he never forgot about Texas, right? He always went back to the Texas Hill Country, and as I've learned from my distinguished colleagues here, he came back to El Paso many times. Texas issues were important to him, and he never forgot about that. And so the Chamizal issue had been very real for him for a long, long time, long before President Kennedy had met with President Lopez Mateos. So in 1954, you can find him admonishing President Eisenhower, who he had a very positive relationship with, and publicly telling him in front of the media, it's time that we do something to resolve the Chamizal issue. He was very well aware of what was going on while he was still a senator. And so you can bet that when, after President Kennedy met with President Lopez Mateos, that when Mateos had mentioned Chamizal as part of their talks, that President Kennedy would have come back and talked to LBJ. Tell me more about this. What are the issues in mind? So he was, you know, he had this long-term commitment to Mexico. Dr. Gillette also, from his interviews with Lady Bird, mentioned last night how much LBJ loved Mexico. He loved the Latin American relationship, but he, especially as the Texas congressman and senator, had always had a lifelong interest in having positive relationships with Mexico, and he made that real. Two other things I'd like to mention that connect to Chamizal. In 1959, when LBJ was the Senate Majority Leader, he is so powerful in doing that as the Majority Leader that he hosts an official head of state visit by President Lopez Mateos of Mexico to the LBJ ranch. Now that's not supposed to happen, okay? A head of state visit is president to president, but LBJ is not just any other Senate Majority Leader, and so that was approved. He came to the LBJ ranch the exhibit shows photos of President Mateos clowning around with country singer Eddie Arnold's guitar. And so there's some really wonderful photos. So we already had this relationship with President Lopez Mateos as the Chamizal issue began to be resolved by the two ambassadors. And so he and Mateos already had that relationship. Later, of course, when President Dìaz Ordaz was elected, President-elect Dìaz Ordaz also came to the LBJ Ranch for an LBJ barbecue. And Dr. Gillette mentioned how they also had had such a long relationship that they were not just friends in an official capacity, but their families were friends and actually spent time together. Johnson spent a lot of time in Mexico. And so when you put all of that together, you begin to see why he would have been in such support of the resolution of the treaty. The national parks. You know, this is a private citizen, that's not just speaking to you. But, you know, LBJ, in his vision of the Great Society, had an idea that he would finish the national park system. So part of his incredible legislative legacy is 63 new national parks established during his presidency, including new kinds of parks. And certainly Chamizal was a new kind of a national park, an urban park, speaking about not where military conflict had taken place, which we'd had parks like that before, but the peaceful settlement of a long dispute between two nations. So Chamizal is significant in part of Lyndon Johnson's legacy. So, of course, we all know that it was President Kennedy's tragic assassination that made Lyndon Johnson the president. But his involvement and dedication to Mexico, to the resolution of the Chamizal issue, and his action, as we can learn from our colleagues here, were all an important factor in this very important part of history. So I'll wrap up with that, and thank you so much.
So Gus talked about how these great global historic figures, President Kennedy, President Lopez Mateos in Mexico, and then President Johnson, and then eventually President Dìaz Ordaz, shaped the settlement. But what gets overlooked in that, the global story, as usually told, is that the really, really hard work was done here at the local level. The two presidents met in Mexico City at the height of the Cold War, 1962. President Kennedy is really worried about growing Cuban influence in Mexico and really wants to solidify our relationship with Mexico. And one of the things that President Lopez Mateos immediately comes to is this huge thorn that's been in the side of our country's relationships for a century, and that's the Chamizal border dispute. So President Kennedy commits to doing something about it, returns back, and comes to a man who's been mentioned a couple of times here today, who is arguably the most important figure in this whole saga, and maybe one of the most underappreciated leaders in El Paso's history. And that's Joseph Friedkin, who was the U.S. Commissioner on the International Boundary and Water Commission. And essentially, President Johnson comes back and says, or President Kennedy comes back and says, fix this. And so he turns over the real heavy work to Mr. Friedkin and his counterpart in Mexico, and people like Cruzito, who were at the International Boundary and Water Commission at that point, have this huge task in front of them. How do you settle this dispute that will involve relocating hundreds of people or thousands of people, some of the businesses that were discussed earlier. So there's this, once the heads of state reach agreement, the work is really, really just starting. So with that, I want to turn it over to Cruzito.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with this panel. And not long ago, Sally Spinner, who is there, called me to invite me, saying that I was one of the old-timers alive. So I accepted the invitation, and that's what I'm here. in reading the synopsis and editorials of the newspaper, I see that, unless I have missed something, that no reference to the real problem of the Chamizal dispute was mentioned. But this is a problem that originated in the change of the Rio Grande in the earliest, let's say around 1865 or something. There's no definite date because there's no surveys or documentation made and agreed upon by the two sections. Nevertheless, at that time there was no water. The name of the water, it was International Boundary Commission. There was a claim presented by the owner of that piece of land that was affected and that was moved away from the Mexican side as a result of a rapid change in the river. That was Mr. Pedro Garcia. And he put a claim. The original claim came around 1895. And they began working, trying to settle the matter, but to no avail. Because the main obstacles was the river changed rapidly or gradually. In those years, the criteria to go by in demarcation of the boundary was the river is the center line of the river is the boundary between the two countries as stated by the original 1847 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But whenever there's a rapid change, the river should go back to where it was before. Unfortunately, there was no documentation in Mexico or even here as to what was the real position of the river when that event happened. Well, they went arguing back and forth as to what was the first, that was the center of discussion. Was it by rapid movement or slow movement? That was one case. Well, nevertheless, as a result of this, the commission, meaning the US commissioner, Mexican commissioner, submitted the case for arbitration. In all these writings and synopses, there is no reference to this arbitration. The arbitration of 1911, which one of the commissioners, I don't know the title, if it was a commissioner, Lafleur from Canada, he ruled in favor of Mexico. And this is where the real Chamizal problem and dispute began. There are so many things about the benefits. Yes, we know about the benefits that brought the settlement of the Chamizal problem. But the real solution to the Chamizal problem was to relocate the river so that Mexico will gain or transfer back to Mexico 437 acres, which was estimated to be the land under dispute. Well, when Mr. Lafleur ruled in favor of Mexico, the United States did not accept that ruling, claiming that the commission was supposed to say yes or no, I mean, on the land, on the case. But Mr. Lafleur, or Commissioner Lafleur, I don't know what the title, ruled that about 2/3 of that land in dispute belonged to Mexico. That was another point of argument for the United States, saying you were not supposed to divide the land under dispute, and that's why they never accepted. Well, this went on for many years. Unfortunately, in the Mexican side, if you know the dates, 1911, 1910, Mexican Revolution, and problems thereafter for several years, so no action was taken by Mexico. But in 1925, after the Mexican Revolution, Mexico wanted to take the case to an international court. And that's why the two countries, the two presidents agreed to try to settle the problem diplomatically. And since then, efforts were made. 1925, according to the records, most of the presidents, US presidents, approached Mexico to settle the problem, because this was, as you said before, a thorn that was bad for the image and the relationship of US with the rest of the world. And then comes the, what do you call, the meeting between the two presidents. But let me say something here. This is unofficial, I mean, it's not in the records. But when the two presidents, Kennedy and Lopez Mateos, met in Mexico City, they had a very, very vivid and sincere conversation. As a result of this, we learned that Mr. Lopez Mateos, in his dissertation at the University of Mexico City, his dissertation was on this subject, Chamizal settlement. So he was an attorney, a lawyer. So he knew the legal problems in addition to the technical problems. And that's when the two were very enthusiastic, and the Mexican president agreed to give instructions to the commissioner, US Commissioner, Mr. Fricken, and Lopez Mateos to Commissioner David Herrera Jordan. Right after that meeting in Mexico City, Commissioner Fricken came to us. I was working at that time, you know, I had only about, let's see, not even 4 or 5 years with them. And he came and began working immediately on trying to settle the problem. Commissioner Fricken always, during that period, consulted and kept informed the local authorities, municipal, county, state, and whoever. As a matter of fact, Commissioner Fricken, in meeting with Bowie High School ex-alumna or alumna, they objected. He said, in trying to settle this problem, be sure that the relocated river will not go, the Bowie High School will not go to Mexico. And believe me, this is one case that we have to draw many options and alternatives, and always try to go around Bowie High so that that piece of land will not go to Mexico. That's what it made it, you know, a little technically trying to have a straight river, avoid the meandering, and at the same time to have it relocated straight. Well, these cases went on, and Commissioner Fricken, every time that he went to Mexico City, he would take the exhibits where we were working. In those years, the computers, you know, as we have them now, were not available. So we used to draw the lines and planimeter. We were planimetering and coming up. What we were trying to do is to come up with the specified acreage, which was 437. Apparently that acreage was 2/3 of the entire land that Mexico was claiming, but they settled for that. And what else? There's a lot to talk on this, but nevertheless, they began doing the presentations. The Commissioner Fricken would go back and forth, and every time that he would come back, he was trying to give credit to all the employees. He would say, your exhibits, these exhibits, were in the hands of President Kennedy and President Lopez Mateos. This is something that he always gave us that credit. Well, as a, let me see, the settlement really, when it came about, it was to return. There is no such a thing that the main objective was to straighten the river. No. The rectification project had occurred already in 1933. So there was no reason from the lower end of Cordova Island to Fort Quitman, the river was meandering about 155 miles, and the rectification project eliminated that meandering and straightened the river from the lower end of the so-called Cordova Island to Fort Quitman. 155 miles were reduced to about 84, 85. This is what one fact. Now, and there are so many things, but I don't want to take so much of the time in here. If there's more questions or clarifications, I'll be glad to say and talk. But there was an important issue. So in all those alternatives and options, trying to respect what Mr. Fricken wanted as a result of his meeting with the ex-alumna or alumna from Bowie High, said, do not give away this piece of land. So we always have to go around, okay? Another thing is that this is important. There's misconceptions. The Cordova Island was the result of a flood that occurred in 1895 or something like that. And to avoid damages because there were people from the Mexican side living in the Cordova Island, the so-called Cordova Island. There was a flood, and in order to avoid going through that curve of the river, meandering the river, they cut artificially the upper end and arranged it to go through a short cut instead of going through there. And by no means Cordova Island was not in dispute with this Chamizal. There's no such a, they've been confusing the issue, saying that Cordova Island was part of the settlement. No, part of the land that belonged to Mexico was sure taken, but that was under no dispute. Well, I think that's enough for now, and we'll go.
So I think Cruz gave us some very important historical context there, so thank you very much. I think that really sort of set the stage for how we got to that period in 1962, 1963 when we were trying to work it out. Travis indicated in his remarks that the community leadership was very unified in the approach to this. But as Cruz just alluded to with the mention of the Bowie alumni, there were people with vested interest in this issue, and so it wasn't like all of El Paso agreed on the path, or all of Juarez agreed on the path to settling this. There really were some things to be worked out, and it took some really masterful diplomacy to kind of bring all of these various people together. And with that, I set the stage for Sam to talk a little bit about what he witnessed back when this was being settled. Sam?
I'll speak rather briefly. First of all, my fellow historian here, Nick Hauser, and I find ourselves just like the man at the end of an irrigation ditch. That we sometimes run out of both time and money. I'd like to also acknowledge the presence in our audience of our youngest historian, here in the second row. Can you have her wave to the audience? Yeah, there we are. Thank you, dear, for your presence. And first of all, Nick and I will be talking about a time when Lyndon Johnson was not president. This is the early part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century. We have to regard the Chamizal, particularly the arbitration of 1911, as taking place in a very, very unusual time. In May of 1911, from May 8th to May 11th, the Battle of Juarez broke out right across here. I mean, loud, dynamite, machine guns, Pancho Villa, Madero forces, a significant federal force over there, all within sight and sound of El Paso. Now, who arrives right after this is just winding up, but the Arbitration Commission, added to by a Canadian jurist, to have an arbitration, international arbitration. Can you imagine such a thing? And here you're trying to settle river boundary changing, and here you've got all this noise on the other side. Well, it's virtually impossible. To show you the importance that the El Paso Times paid to the arrival of several of the significant participants in the 1911 arbitration, their arrival was mentioned on page 8 of the Times, right under an article concerning a local bicycle theft. The commission had its works cut out for it, and as Cruz pointed out, as in many arbitrations, the arbitrator split the difference, although the terms of the arbitration was you got one tract of land. Who owns it? And so the presiding commissioner, the Canadian jurist, with the reluctant joinder of the Mexican commissioner, said, okay, we'll split it. Well, that left General Anson Mills, our commissioner, with the unenviable task of saying we can't follow the decision in an international arbitration because it didn't meet the terms of submission. Now, that was the legal reason. As the practical reason that he perhaps said we really can't do business at this time is that before the Arbitration Commission concluded its work in May of 1911 and issued this decision dividing the tract, the Porfirio Diaz government in Mexico had collapsed. And Porfirio Diaz got in a ship and went to Paris, where he lived the rest of his days. So here General Mills had a country, well, who's in charge here? There wasn't anybody in charge. In fact, there wasn't anybody in charge for quite a few years. And as had been pointed out earlier, things just kind of went on and on and on. Now, prior to the 1911 arbitration, international arbitration between countries had a good popularity. In other words, as a alternative to war. Let's arbitrate. And there were a lot of international arbitrations. Theodore Roosevelt arbitrated the end of the Russo-Japanese War, for instance. But with World War I, subsequent wars and like that, international arbitration has almost gone away from our scene. So if you're going to take one thing away from the early history of the Chamizal and the arbitration, let's give everybody back there involved a break. You were trying to do something in the most difficult of times, and the fact that it was a so-called failed arbitration, let's not kick them around about that. Now, an interesting sidelight is that the Mexican representatives at the international arbitration were all Porfirio Diaz appointees. By the end of the month, with the Porfirio Diaz government gone, they certainly were not going to walk back across the bridge to Juarez. They'd probably be shot. Several of the leading members went to Europe, some went to New York City, but none of them went back. None of them went back. So that's just kind of a little sidelight. I'll conclude my remarks with arbitration in river boundaries, just like common walls between neighbors here in the city. They're nothing but trouble. From your argument with your neighbor to the argument that, like the Chamizal, it's always there and it's always going to be with us. Now, even though you've been down to the Chamizal National Memorial, by the way, don't rush down today. It's closed. But please, take it upon yourself. It's a lovely setting. It's beautifully run, outstanding exhibits. It's quiet. Go down there again sometime. Thank you all for coming today.
Hauser has done a lot of work on various parts of Southwestern history, with a lot of focus lately on Benito Juarez and his role in Mexico and in developing this region. So, Nick, I noticed you nodding a lot when we're making the points there with Mr. Moore. Do you want to kind of pick up on the sort of the broader historical context there?
Yeah, okay. I guess I'll start from kind of a personal point of view, going back to when I was in my mid-20s, like some of you have mentioned, when you were young. I was a student at the University of Arizona in anthropology. I came originally from Portland, Oregon. The reason I went to University of Arizona to study anthropology was, I hate to admit, was really related to the climate, because it rained so much in Portland. And I wanted to go to a place that was nice and dry and sunny and warm. And I met with the staff at at Portland State College in Oregon. And they asked me if I had selected a school for graduate school, and I said yes. And I was scared because I didn't want to tell them what the reason was. And they said, what school? And I said, University of Arizona. They said, excellent, excellent. Okay, great. I'd considered Albuquerque, but I looked at the climate charts, it got cold in the winter. Anyway, I went to University of Arizona, and I really, I learned quite a lot there. It was really good for me. However, one late spring day, and the professor was giving his lecture, he said, would someone be interested in doing research this summer in a community, Indian community, that we know very little about? It's in El Paso. But you should know some Spanish. Well, I knew a little Spanish, not a lot. I thought, well, there'll be 7 or 8 students after class and they'll be interested in going to El Paso. I didn't really want to go back where I worked every summer, sometimes double shifts in the paper mill, smelly paper mill, but I made quite a lot of money at the time. So I was the only student, and I was amazed. And so they got me a little grant, and then I got another grant through Rio Bravo. And I drove in my little car to El Paso. And guess who I met when I got here? Tom Diamond. Your friend, right? You know, a lot of you know Tom Diamond. And he was a lawyer. He's in his 90s, and he's bright as ever. Very intelligent, good person. And he took me down to Isleta, to the Tewa Indians, and I lived in a little house, 4-room adobe with about 8 people. And they gave me one room, and the kids, some of the kids had to sleep in the kitchen on the floor. They were incredible in terms of hospitality. Well, I started doing research, and one of the things that the tribe was interested, of course, getting recognized, was getting their land grant back. They told me that they had a lot of land there called the Isleta Grant. So I started doing research, especially in deeds. I went through at least 20,000 or more deeds. Tom Diamond said, don't go to deed indexes, just go to each book, like 20-some, 30 books. And so that's what I started to do. And then one day I was visiting him and his wife in their home in El Paso on the west side, and the phone rang. Tom picked it up, was talking to someone on the phone. Then he said, Nick, this man has questions that I can't answer. And I think you'll probably be knowledgeable, because you've been working on the land grant and the tribe and all this, you know, for at least a month or so. So this must have been in July or something when this happened. So he said, it's the White House calling. I said, what? The store? What are we talking about? No, it's the White House, Washington, D.C. Oh my God, you know, I'm 20-some years old and my hand's shaky. I pick up the phone and I'm talking to Bill Moyers, who was press secretary. And he asked me a number of questions about the tribe and if they'd been recognized before, if they'd served as Indian Scouts with the U.S. Army and the Texas Rangers. So that's great. So I answered the questions, and that's my only association with LBJ. And I think I had another call maybe a week later from him. But anyway, he was very helpful in helping the tribe, and he and LBJ, and helping the tribe get recognized, okay? So that was interesting. When I started looking at deeds and what have you, and looking at the history of the area, I realized I just couldn't look at Isleta. I had to look at the entire community, non-Indians. Some of the folks were Chinese or Asian people. Some were from the Middle East, blah, 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 that had farms and were in the area. You know, they were all over. And also I was interested because I found out from doing my research, I knew nothing about El Paso till I got there, that the native people when Oñate came here in 1598 were the Manzos and Suma Indians, okay? So I got kind of interested in that. I didn't really know much. And I thought, well, every time I have a free day, maybe on a Saturday or Sunday, I'll go over to Juarez and I'll go to the old partidos, the old districts. I go way back and I'll ask these people in my broken Spanish a couple questions. And it went like this, I'm sorry, but it wasn't very good. But it was, perdóname, señor, señora, usted ha oído de la gente indígena que vivieron aquí hasta hace muchos años, blah, blah, blah. And they would look, you know, they were nice and polite, and so I'm like, what is this crazy gringo, you know, asking these questions? A lot of them, some people would say, I'm from Durango, I don't know anything. Or they'd be very polite and walk away and sort of shake their head smiling. This got to be embarrassing and difficult. And I did it for maybe 12, 15 days or so. I was getting absolutely nowhere. I left the area where the old Guadalupe mission is, that's the Manzo mission, and I went to San Lorenzo, okay? And I saw an old man. Anyone old to me was at least 50, you know, I'm in my 20s. And he's sipping a refresco on a bench, on a banco there in the plaza. And I went up to him and did my, perdóname, señor, usted ha oído, blah, blah, blah. And he stood up and he said, I'm Manzo Indian, and I'm in Spanish, I'm Manzo Indian and I'm proud of it. I about fell over, I couldn't believe it. And then his name was Natividad Camargo. His son is Cruz Camargo, who lives here in the San Elizario area today, and is a really good person. Unfortunately, his father passed away in his 80s or so, but it was incredible. And he took me over to the Manzo Indian descendants that lived in La Colonia de San Jose, which is called El Pueblito. And I met them. They're very nice, they're very helpful, and they started talking to me. And I was amazed because, you know what they told me? They said, some of our people lived in the Chamizal. I said, what? And yes, they lived in the Chamizal near the river. And Natividad Camargo said, we lived in the Banco de Camargo. Our family did, named after us, Manzo Indians, just a little bit upriver from where the Chamizal is. In fact, it adjoined the Chamizal. Well, this is interesting. I really didn't know anything about the Chamizal. At the time, 1966, I heard stuff that I paid no attention to, and that was that there was some kind of a basketball team at UTEP, and they were winning, and I don't know, I could care less, you know, I wasn't into sports, just, you know, didn't pay any attention to it. And so I started thinking, well, this is interesting. Chamizal, I don't know anything about it. Then I heard on the news something about Chamizal and a land dispute or something. Didn't pay any attention to it. I was focusing on Isleta at the time. But it was really interesting because then gradually my mind began to, you know, open up and started thinking, gosh, the Chamizal, I don't know anything about it. And then later I did historical research. Well, almost the same time, I guess, but later I did a lot of historical research. And I looked at some of the Boundary Commission reports and interviews from, 1897, I believe. You know, there were a series of them. And one of the men, I think in 1897, his name was Carino Lara. And he was at the meeting of the Boundary Commissioners about the land dispute. And he provided some information, and he's reported in the document as being the governor of the Indians. First I didn't quite understand what that was, and then I realized, oh my God, he's a Manzo Indian governor. And he said he was born in the area, let me see, I'm trying to think what area he was born in, right next to, in San Lorenzo. And no, he was in the Chamizal area, and then he moved to San Lorenzo, that was it. Oh, anyway, he talked about the fact that they had land in the area, and then they had floods. And if you look at the history of the Rio Grande, it's capricious, it's unpredictable, you never know what it's going to do. And it would come down, you know, and often in the spring, who knows, sometimes even in the fall, and big floods would take place. And sometimes these floods took place way up north, you know, in New Mexico and further up, Colorado, and the river would become swollen and, you know, and come down surging. And sometimes it would just be a heavy inundation of rains, or in the Las Cruces, El Paso area, and there'd be a lot of damage. But, I mean, the river did good things. It brought in what? It brought in water, I mean, obviously. And during the floods, it brought in a little more water, and over the banks, though it was flooded. And there were areas that were called wetlands or bosques, and that was great for hunters and game, birds, and what have you. And the Manzo and Suma Indians lived along the river, and they took advantage of that. They did their hunting and what have you, and the Manzos had some agriculture, the Sumas did, and the Sumas were more Apache-like than the Manzos. The Manzos were a Pueblo people, and they even had clans that were very similar to those in New Mexico. And anyway, I became aware that the Chamizal was an area where the Manzos and Sumas had been. And interesting, Nestor called me the other day and told me about what happened in the San Elizario area, whereby back in 1896 or thereabouts, the Boundary Commission met, and people were upset because in the San Elizario area, where there was a bosque, I think it was called Urucan, I believe it was called, a big sandbar, a big area with wetlands. The river didn't have much respect for the United States in that area. It started to flood in on our soil rather than the other way. The other way was always, you know, going into Mexico. And so they lost some land. At least the people in San Elizario, the river started to come in cut in on the U.S. bank. So anyway, some of the commissioners from the United States suggested, oh, let's have a land exchange here to, you know, resolve this settlement with the Chamizal. Let's let the Chamizal lands. Let me see. They could go to those disputed lands could be part of the United States. No problem. They already are. Blah blah blah. You know, they're on our side of the river, and then. We'll do an exchange. We'll give Mexico the lands that are down in San Elizario, where the river, you know, invaded, U.S. territory, and we'll do this as a settlement. Well, Mexico wasn't too hot about it. The reason was that San Elizario was kind of a area of bosques and what have you, not a large population. Whereas the Chamizal was considered a very important district or of Ciudad Juarez, or a VP of the Ciudad Juarez. So anyway, that never happened. But anyway, I don't want to ramble on and on here, but it was interesting. I started looking at census records from Ciudad Juarez at Paso del Norte, and there's the Chamizal again popping up, and there's people, Indian people, Manzo mainly. They identify as Manzos, and the leaders are recognized. The cacique, the chief, is recognized, and the name is Lara. And there's Roybal, also governor and what have you. So anyway, there was an Indian population there, and that's often not known. And well, what else is there to say? I think that's about it. What else? We talked about.
Actually, Dick, I think we're sort of over time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's it, because I just wanted to mention what my background with the Native Americans in the area and the history. Thank you.